Hello everyone. Welcome to Curse Chronicles, and I'm here to help you unwind tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot. Now get comfortable, relax, and let the sound of the rain guide you as we dive into tonight's stories, sweet dreams, or perhaps something more chilling awaits. Emily Parker wasn't easily frightened, but as she drove her beat-up sedan into the outskirts of Hollow Creek, she felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. A journalist for an up-and-coming online magazine specializing in urban legends, Emily had made a career out of debunking ghost stories and unraveling local myths. Her latest assignment brought her to this tiny, forgotten town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, where whispers of the infamous Blackthorn Manor had persisted for over a century. The mansion, an imposing relic of the late 1800s, sat on the edge of a dark forest, its silhouette looming like a blackened scar against the twilight sky. Locals claimed it was cursed, though no one dared to speak openly about the horrors tied to its name. Emily's editor, however, was insistent. The mystery of Blackthorn Manor would draw readers, and Emily, ever the skeptic, was the perfect person to take on the job. She'd planned to spend 2 nights in the mansion, armed with her laptop, camera, and a flashlight, ready to expose the truth behind the folklore. Her first stop was the town's only diner, a dingy but charming spot called Maddie's Eats. The locals were an odd bunch, quiet, watchful, and quick to avert their gazes when Emily mentioned the manor. An elderly waitress named Marla finally broke the silence, her voice hushed but laced with urgency. "You don't go there, sweetheart," Marla warned, leaning in close. "No one who stays at Blackthorn comes back the same. Some don't come back at all." Emily pressed for details, but Marla only shook her head, muttering something about the screams in the woods and a shadow that watches. Intrigued rather than deterred, Emily decided to dig deeper. She stopped by the local library, where she found brittle newspaper clippings and faded photographs chronicling the house's grim history. The mysterious disappearance of the Blackthorn family in 1897, a rash of unsolved murders in the 1950s, and the inexplicable vanishing of a group of ghost hunters just 2 decades ago. The common thread in every account was the same: a pervasive sense of being watched and the inescapable feeling of dread. By the time she reached Blackthorn Manor, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape bathed in a dim, foreboding glow. The mansion was more intimidating than Emily had imagined. Its once grand facade was now a decaying ruin, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and shattered windows gaping like empty eyes. The iron gate screeched as she pushed it open, its rusted hinges protesting loudly in the silence. As she stepped inside, the air grew noticeably colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over her. The interior was a labyrinth of dust-covered furniture, cobweb-draped chandeliers, and peeling wallpaper. It was as though time had frozen within these walls, trapping the house in a perpetual state of decay. Despite the unease creeping into her chest, Emily set up her equipment in the grand parlor, determined to document every creak and shadow. Her skepticism remained intact, at least for now. As the night deepened, Emily found herself surrounded by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the smallest sounds. Sitting in the grand parlor of Blackthorn Manor, she reviewed the photos she had taken earlier. Each shot revealed the expected disrepair: sagging wooden beams, torn drapery, and ornate furniture reduced to little more than skeletons of their former selves. Yet, one image caught her attention. In the photograph of the main staircase, a faint, blurry shape hovered near the banister. A shadow too defined to be a trick of the light, but too vague to discern its source. Goosebumps prickled her skin, but she brushed off the unease. It must have been dust or a lens flare, she thought, though her fingers hesitated over the delete button. The first hours passed uneventfully, save for the occasional groan of the house settling or the distant patter of what she assumed was a raccoon scurrying through the attic. By midnight, she decided to explore. Armed with her flashlight, a notebook, and her camera, Emily ventured into the east wing, where the family's bedrooms were located. The air felt different here, heavier, colder, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a chill. Her flashlight beam illuminated portraits of long-dead Blackthorn ancestors, their faces frozen in expressions of stoic severity. One portrait in particular caught her eye: a young woman in a dark green dress with piercing gray eyes that seemed to follow Emily as she moved. The nameplate beneath read Margaret Blackthorn, 1875-1897. The year she disappeared, Emily whispered to herself, jotting the detail down. As she stepped back, a faint sound, like a sigh, drifted through the hallway. She froze, her pulse quickening. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, from the room at the end of the hall. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Summoning her courage, Emily pushed the door open with her foot and stepped inside. The room appeared to be a nursery, its once cheerful decor now faded and decayed. A small crib sat in the corner, its mattress rotted through and its wooden frame splintered. On the wall, the remnants of a painted mural depicted a pastoral scene of rolling hills and a golden sun. But the paint had warped over the years, giving the sun an unsettling, almost leering grin. Suddenly, a faint creak echoed from behind her. Spinning around, Emily's flashlight landed on the door, now swinging slowly shut. Her throat tightened as the realization set in. There was no draft in the house, no wind that could have moved it. Her rational mind fought for an explanation, but before she could act, a soft, rhythmic tapping began on the window behind her. She turned, half expecting to see the branches of a tree scratching against the glass. Instead, she saw nothing but the reflection of her own pale, wide-eyed face staring back. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Heart pounding, she edged closer, raising the flashlight toward the window. Then, just as she reached it, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, but it lasted only a moment before a sudden, blood-curdling scream erupted from the hallway. Emily dropped her flashlight in shock, the beam spinning wildly as it clattered to the floor. Her instincts told her to run, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled her to move toward the sound. She stepped into the hallway, her breath shallow and her hands trembling. The scream had come from Margaret's room. The door, which she was certain had been closed, was now wide open, revealing an eerie glow spilling out into the hallway. Against her better judgment, Emily stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and something metallic, like blood. On the floor, scratched deep into the rotting planks, were symbols she couldn't recognize, each one pulsating faintly as though alive. Her camera clicked as she took pictures, the sound feeling too loud in the unnatural quiet. Then, just as she lowered the camera, something shifted in the corner of the room. A shadow detached itself from the wall, moving with an unnatural, jerking motion. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to take shape, a vaguely human form with elongated limbs and a featureless face. It stood there, silent and unmoving, yet she felt its gaze boring into her. She tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The figure twitched, then lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Emily screamed, stumbling backward and slamming the door shut. She braced herself against it, her heart racing as the room fell silent once more. No footsteps, no scraping at the door, nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. When she finally gathered the courage to open the door again, the hallway was empty, and Margaret's room was dark, as if the glowing symbols had never been there. Shaken but determined, Emily returned to the parlor, clutching her camera like a talisman. She spent the rest of the night poring over her photos, hoping to find some evidence of what she had seen. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., her laptop screen began to flicker, and one by one, her photos corrupted, each image distorting into a grotesque blur of faces and shadows. For the first time, Emily began to doubt her skepticism. Whatever haunted Blackthorn Manor, it was real, and it wasn't finished with her yet. By the time dawn crept through the shattered windows of Blackthorn Manor, Emily's confidence was hanging by a thread. The events of the previous night had left her shaken, her once steely resolve giving way to an anxious energy that hummed in her veins. She had come to Hollow Creek to debunk a myth, but the shadows in this house felt too real to dismiss. Determined to regain control of the situation, she decided to delve deeper into the mansion's history, hoping that answers might provide some semblance of safety. As she packed her camera and notebook, she noticed a strange smell wafting through the air, earthy and metallic, like damp soil mixed with rust. The scent grew stronger as she moved toward the library, a room she hadn't explored yet. The library was a cavernous space, its shelves lined with crumbling tomes and dust-coated journals. The air here felt heavier, as though the room itself was alive with a presence. Emily began rifling through the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of books with titles long faded. She found old volumes on Victorian architecture, alchemy, and folklore, but it was a leather-bound journal tucked behind a broken bust that caught her attention. The name embossed on the cover sent a chill down her spine. Margaret Blackthorn, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor. Emily opened the journal, her pulse quickening as she scanned the handwritten pages. Margaret's entries started innocently enough, recounting her days spent painting in the garden and attending lavish family dinners. But as Emily flipped further into the journal, the tone grew darker. Margaret wrote about strange dreams, visions of shadowy figures standing at the edge of her bed, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She described waking up with inexplicable scratches on her arms and hearing voices calling her name from the forest behind the manor. Her family dismissed her fears, chalking them up to an overactive imagination. But the final entries told a different story, one of desperation and fear. Margaret wrote of a ritual, something her father had become obsessed with after the death of her younger brother, Thomas. According to her, he believed the forest held a power that could bridge the gap between life and death. He had stumbled upon an ancient text, a grimoire locked away in the manor's basement, that described a way to summon a guardian who could grant wishes in exchange for devotion. Desperate to bring Thomas back, Margaret's father had begun the ritual, but something had gone wrong. Instead of a benevolent guardian, the ritual had summoned a malevolent entity, one that had attached itself to the family and the house. Margaret's final entry was a chilling warning. To whoever reads this, leave this place. The shadow is bound here, but it feeds on those who trespass. It cannot be destroyed, only contained. Do not awaken it. Emily's hands trembled as she closed the journal, her mind racing. The scratches on the nursery floor, the shadowy figure she had seen the night before, it all aligned too perfectly with Margaret's account. Her first instinct was to leave, to abandon the story, and run as far from Blackthorn Manor as possible. But something compelled her to stay. Maybe it was journalistic pride, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that she needed to understand what had happened to Margaret and her family. Whatever the reason, Emily found herself heading toward the basement, Margaret's warning echoing in her mind. The basement door was hidden behind a tapestry in the dining room, its heavy oak frame secured with a rusted lock. Using a hairpin, Emily fumbled with the mechanism until it clicked open. The staircase beyond descended into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. The walls were lined with damp stone, and the faint smell of decay hung in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, Emily found herself in a cavernous room filled with bizarre artifacts. Animal bones arranged in spirals, rusted tools that looked like they belonged to a torture chamber, and shelves lined with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. But it was the altar in the center of the room that stole her breath. The altar was a grotesque slab of stone, its surface etched with the same symbols she had seen scratched into the nursery floor. At its base lay an open book, the grimoire Margaret had mentioned. The pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with strange, angular script and unsettling illustrations of figures bound in chains, their faces contorted in agony. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her curiosity pushed her forward. As she flipped through the pages, she found detailed instructions for the ritual Margaret's father had attempted. One passage stood out, written in English rather than the cryptic script. Once summoned, the shadow binds itself to the place of its summoning. It hungers for fear, feeding off those who wander too close. If disrupted, the shadow will punish the intruder until balance is restored. The room seemed to grow darker as she read, the flickering beam of her flashlight dimming unnaturally. A low, guttural sound echoed through the basement, a growl, deep and resonant, that vibrated through her chest. Emily spun around, her flashlight landing on the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, something moved. It was the same figure she had seen the night before, its elongated limbs twitching as it stepped closer. Emily's breath caught as the figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. The growl deepened, resonating with an otherworldly force that made her ears ring. Clutching the journal and her flashlight, Emily bolted up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, as though the entity was savoring the chase. She reached the parlor and slammed the basement door shut, pushing a heavy cabinet against it for good measure. The house fell silent once more, but Emily knew the peace was temporary. The shadow was awake now, and it wasn't going to let her leave without a fight. As dawn broke, Emily sat huddled in a corner of the parlor, flipping through Margaret's journal for answers. She needed to find a way to contain the entity, just as Margaret had tried to warn her. But as the morning light spilled into the room, Emily noticed something strange. The symbols from the grimoire had begun to appear on the walls around her, glowing faintly as if branded into the house itself. Blackthorn Manor wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted her to stay. Emily sat curled up on the tattered love seat in the grand parlor, Margaret's journal clutched to her chest like a lifeline. The creeping daylight offered no comfort. Instead, it seemed to highlight the house's decay and amplify the unnatural silence that had settled over it. Every corner of the room felt like a trap, every shadow a potential hiding place for the entity that stalked her. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Her body and mind were unraveling under the strain of constant dread. The symbols that had begun glowing faintly on the walls had spread overnight, weaving a chaotic tapestry of lines and runes across the parlor. She tried to focus on deciphering the journal, her rational mind clinging to the hope that Margaret's warnings might hold a clue to survival. But the longer she read, the more fragmented and incoherent Margaret's writing became, as if the woman's sanity had frayed as the entity's presence tightened its grip. By mid-afternoon, Emily decided to venture out of the house to clear her head. She needed space, air, anything to distance herself from the oppressive energy within those walls. But as she stepped out onto the overgrown front lawn, she was met with an unexpected sight. The forest that surrounded Blackthorn Manor now appeared impossibly dense, the trees gnarled and twisted as though they had grown overnight. Worse, the path she had taken to reach the house was gone, replaced by a tangle of roots and thorns that seemed to pulse faintly, almost like veins. It was as if the house had reshaped the world around it, trapping her in its suffocating embrace. Panic set in, and she sprinted toward what she thought was the road, only to find herself right back at the mansion's front steps. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, the realization dawning that escape was no longer an option. The house had her now, and it wouldn't let go. As she re-entered the manor, the air grew colder, and an eerie hum vibrated through the floorboards. She moved cautiously, the wooden floors creaking beneath her weight. It was then she noticed something new, the faint sound of children laughing. It was distant at first, barely audible, but as she climbed the staircase, it grew louder, filling the air with a high-pitched, echoing joy that felt grotesquely out of place in the rotting, desolate house. The laughter led her to the nursery she had explored the night before, and this time, the door was wide open, as if beckoning her inside. Against her better judgment, she stepped in. The room had changed. The warped, rotting furniture was gone, replaced by pristine toys and furniture as though it had been restored to its former glory. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the mural on the wall now looked fresh and vibrant, the leering sun replaced with a gentle smile. For a fleeting moment, Emily wondered if she was hallucinating, her mind conjuring this vision as a defense mechanism. Then she saw them, the children. 3 children sat in a circle on the floor, their backs to her. They appeared normal at first glance, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked straight out of a Victorian portrait. But as Emily took a cautious step closer, her stomach twisted. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on strings. One of them, a little girl with blonde curls, turned her head sharply to the side, revealing a face that was wrong. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth twisted into a smile that stretched too far. "Come play with us," the girl said, her voice layered with an echo that didn't belong to a child. Emily stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She fell hard, the impact jarring her already frayed nerves. The children all turned toward her now, their faces identical, black eyes, 2 wide smiles, heads cocked at unnatural angles. The blonde girl crawled toward her, moving on all 4s like an animal. "Don't be scared," she cooed. "We just want to play." Emily scrambled to her feet and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. The laughter turned to screams, high, piercing wails that followed her down the hallway. Her legs carried her blindly, and she found herself in the dining room once again. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter now, their light casting eerie patterns across the room. The once barren dining table was now set with a feast, roasted meats, steaming bread, bowls of fruit, yet the food exuded a sickly sweet smell that made Emily gag. At the head of the table sat a figure she hadn't noticed at first, shrouded in shadow. It was massive, its shape indistinct, and as Emily approached, it leaned forward slightly, revealing 2 pinpricks of light where its eyes should have been. "Hungry?" it asked, its voice a guttural rumble that reverberated through the room. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but she felt its presence enveloping her, pressing down on her like a physical weight. Without thinking, she turned and ran again, her feet carrying her to the one place she thought might offer answers, the basement. The descent into the basement felt longer this time, the stairs stretching endlessly into the dark. When she finally reached the bottom, the room was different. The artifacts she had seen earlier were gone, replaced by a swirling black void in the center of the floor. The symbols on the walls and floor pulsed with light, growing brighter and faster in rhythm. Emily hesitated at the edge of the void, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But something drew her closer, a faint voice, soft and familiar. "Help me," it whispered, and Emily realized with a start that it sounded like Margaret. Against her better judgment, Emily reached out, her hand trembling as she extended it toward the void. The second her fingers brushed its surface, a searing pain shot through her arm, and she was pulled in. The world around her dissolved into chaos, flashes of the past, present, and something beyond comprehension. She saw Margaret kneeling at the altar, her face streaked with tears as she begged the shadow for mercy. She saw the Blackthorn family at a grand feast, their faces slowly distorting into grotesque masks as they succumbed to the entity's influence. And she saw herself, trapped in the manor, her face pale and hollow, her eyes black voids like the children's. When she awoke, she was back in the parlor, the journal lying open on her lap. The symbols on the walls were now faint, their glow reduced to a flicker. But Emily knew the house wasn't finished with her. She could feel the shadow watching, waiting for her next move. Every breath she took felt borrowed, every second a gift the entity could revoke at any moment. She was no longer just a visitor in Blackthorn Manor. She was part of it now. The following night settled over Blackthorn Manor like a suffocating shroud. Emily could no longer deny that her time was running out. The oppressive presence of the entity, the shadow, was no longer subtle. It no longer waited in the periphery of her vision or lurked in distant corners. It was everywhere now, its malevolent energy saturating the air, seeping into her thoughts, eroding the fragile wall between her sanity and despair. Her every breath felt heavy, her every step dogged by the creeping certainty that she was being watched. And she was. She could feel its gaze, unblinking and unwavering, pressing against her from every direction. Margaret's journal sat open on the table in front of her, its pages illuminated by the flickering light of a single, dying candle. Emily had spent hours poring over the entries, searching desperately for a way to banish the shadow. Her notes were scattered across the table, pages filled with frantic scribbles and half-formed theories. The ritual described in the grimoire was her only lead, but it was incomplete, its instructions deliberately vague as if designed to lure victims into failure. Emily suspected Margaret's father had known this too late, his attempt to manipulate forces beyond his understanding leading to the family's doom. Yet the journal hinted at something, a countermeasure, a ritual to bind the shadow. It required a sacrifice, though Margaret had never clarified what that meant. Emily's mind churned with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Would it demand her blood? Her soul? Her very existence? She didn't know, but she was certain of one thing. If she didn't act, the shadow would consume her entirely. The thought terrified her, but it also steeled her resolve. She couldn't allow herself to succumb to the same fate as Margaret or the Blackthorn family. She gathered her tools, her flashlight, her camera, the journal, and a rusty dagger she'd found in the basement. Its blade was dull, but the strange symbols etched into its hilt matched those on the walls of the manor, suggesting it might hold some significance. With trembling hands, she descended once more into the basement, her footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness thick and oppressive, as though it were a living thing pressing against her skin. The room had transformed yet again. The swirling void she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a crude altar that seemed to have erupted from the stone floor itself. The symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsating like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Surrounding the altar were relics of the Blackthorn family, a tarnished locket, a child's doll, a cracked porcelain teacup. Each item radiated an energy that made Emily's skin crawl, as if they were steeped in the pain and suffering of those who had once owned them. Emily placed Margaret's journal on the altar, flipping to the final page. The handwriting there was jagged and erratic, the words almost illegible. To bind the shadow, one must give willingly what it craves most, fear. Confront it. Offer it the truth of your terror. Only then will it relent. Her fear? Emily's heart raced as she tried to comprehend the meaning. How could she offer something so abstract? And how could she willingly confront the very thing that had been hunting her, tormenting her, since the moment she stepped into this cursed house? The air in the basement grew colder, the symbols on the walls flaring to life with an eerie, pulsating light. Then she felt it, that now familiar shift in the air, the oppressive weight that signaled its presence. The shadow emerged from the darkness, its form barely human but undeniably sentient. Its elongated limbs stretched unnaturally, its face still featureless save for the faint glimmer of two pinpricks of light where its eyes should have been. It moved closer, its jerking, unnatural movements accompanied by the low, guttural growl that had haunted Emily's dreams. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground, clutching the dagger so tightly her knuckles turned white. The shadow stopped just feet away, its presence radiating a malevolent energy that made her knees buckle. Emily struggled to breathe, her chest tightening as the air grew impossibly dense. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside her mind, filling every corner of her consciousness. "Why do you resist?" It demanded, its tone both mocking and curious. "You are mine as they were mine. You cannot escape." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she fought to steady herself. Her body trembled, every fiber of her being screaming in terror, but she refused to give in. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow tilted its head, as though amused by her defiance. "You lie," it hissed, and the room seemed to shake with its anger. "Your fear is palpable. It feeds me. You cannot deny it." Emily realized then what she had to do. She couldn't deny her fear. It was the very thing keeping her alive, the driving force behind her determination to fight back. But she could confront it. She could take control of it. "Yes, I'm afraid," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I'm terrified, but I won't let you use it against me." The shadow recoiled, its form flickering as though destabilized. Emily took a step forward, raising the dagger. "You want my fear? Take it. Take all of it. But you won't have me." With that, she drove the dagger into the altar, the blade sinking deep into the stone as if it were flesh. The symbols on the walls and floor flared brighter than ever, their light blinding. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form contorting wildly as it lashed out, but it couldn't touch her. The room exploded with light, and Emily was thrown backward, her vision swimming as the world around her dissolved into chaos. When she awoke, she was lying on the floor of the parlor, the dagger clutched in her hand. The symbols on the walls were gone, and the oppressive energy that had plagued the house was nowhere to be felt. The shadow was gone, or so it seemed. But as Emily staggered to her feet, she noticed something in the reflection of the cracked mirror above the fireplace. A faint, dark shape lingered just behind her, watching. It wasn't gone. Not entirely. And she realized then that Blackthorn Manor's horror might never truly be defeated. The days following Emily's escape, or what she believed was her escape, from Blackthorn Manor felt like an out-of-body experience. She had no recollection of how she made it back to the small town of Hollow Creek. One moment, she was standing in the parlor, staring at the faint, dark shape in the mirror, and the next, she was stumbling into the town's only diner, her clothes tattered, her hands smeared with dirt and dried blood. The locals stared at her as if she were a ghost, their hushed whispers floating around her like smoke. No one asked her what had happened, but their eyes brimmed with suspicion, as though they already knew. Emily tried to piece together her fragmented memories as she sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The dagger, still clutched in her trembling hand when she arrived, was now hidden in her bag, its weight a constant reminder of the ordeal she had barely survived. Margaret's journal was gone, lost in the chaos of her final confrontation with the shadow. She had nothing to show for her time in Blackthorn Manor, no photographs, no recordings, except for the vivid, unshakable terror that haunted her every waking moment. Sleep was no refuge. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in the manor, wandering its endless, twisting corridors as the shadow stalked her. The laughter of the children echoed in her ears, and she could feel the cold weight of its gaze pressing against her back. Each dream ended the same way, with her standing before the altar, the shadow's form towering over her as it whispered her name in that guttural, inhuman voice. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that she hadn't truly left the manor behind. Determined to make sense of what had happened, Emily began researching the history of Blackthorn Manor in greater depth. She scoured the town's archives, poring over faded newspaper clippings and old photographs. The story of the Blackthorn family was shrouded in mystery, their once prominent lineage reduced to whispered legends of madness and tragedy. The official records listed the family as missing, their disappearance chalked up to a fire that had supposedly destroyed the manor over a century ago. But Emily knew the truth. The manor hadn't burned down. It had simply been abandoned, left to rot and fester as the shadow claimed it as its domain. Her investigation led her to the town's oldest resident, a frail woman named Mrs. Abernathy who had lived in Hollow Creek her entire life. When Emily mentioned Blackthorn Manor, Mrs. Abernathy's cloudy eyes widened with fear. You shouldn't have gone there, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. That place is cursed. It's not just haunted, it's a gateway. A bridge between our world and something else. The Blackthorn family thought they could control it, but they were wrong. And now it's bound to the land, feeding off anyone foolish enough to trespass. Emily pressed for more details, but Mrs. Abernathy grew agitated, her hands shaking as she clutched the edge of her shawl. You've been marked, she said finally, her voice barely audible. You might have escaped, but it's not done with you. It never lets go. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine, but she refused to accept them. She had survived, hadn't she? She had confronted the shadow, driven it back. Surely that had to mean something. Yet strange things continued to happen. Lights flickered and dimmed whenever she entered a room. Mirrors seemed to warp and ripple as though the glass were made of liquid. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even in broad daylight. She began noticing symbols, the same ones that had appeared on the walls of the manor, etched into random places. The bark of a tree, the side of a building, even scrawled faintly in the condensation on her bathroom mirror. It was as if the shadow was reminding her that it was still there, waiting. One night, Emily decided to confront her fear head-on. She set up a camera in her motel room, determined to document the strange occurrences. She turned off the lights and sat in the center of the room, the dagger resting in her lap. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the motel's outdated heater. Just as she began to think nothing would happen, the temperature plummeted, and the camera's lens fogged over. A familiar growl filled the room, low and resonant, vibrating in her chest. The shadow materialized in the corner, its form barely discernible in the dim light. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she gripped the dagger, her knuckles white. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. The shadow didn't answer, but she felt its presence pressing against her mind, its intentions dark and unknowable. For a moment, she thought she saw something in its depths, a glimpse of the Blackthorn family, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow. Then the shadow vanished, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When Emily reviewed the footage the next morning, she found that the camera had captured nothing but static. It was as if the shadow had erased its presence entirely, leaving her to question her own sanity. But she knew what she had seen. The entity wasn't bound to Blackthorn Manor. It had followed her, tethered to her fear and the tenuous connection forged during the ritual. Emily considered going back to the manor, hoping to find a way to sever the bond once and for all. But the thought of returning to that cursed place filled her with dread. Instead, she decided to document her experience, writing down every detail in the hope that someone someday might be able to understand what had happened to her. As she wrote, she realized that the act of recounting her story brought a strange sense of relief, as though she were reclaiming a small part of herself from the shadow's grasp. But even as she filled page after page, the sense of unease never left her. The symbols continued to appear, and the shadow's presence lingered at the edges of her perception. She began to wonder if the act of documenting her experience was feeding the entity, giving it strength. Perhaps it thrived not only on fear but on the act of being remembered, its existence perpetuated through the stories of those it had touched. Emily's final entry was brief. To whoever finds this, be warned. The shadow isn't confined to Blackthorn Manor. It's with me now, always watching, always waiting. If you're reading this, it may be watching you too. And then, just like Margaret Blackthorn before her, Emily vanished without a trace. The motel room was found empty, her belongings scattered as though she had left in a hurry. The camera she had used to document her experience was recovered, but it contained only static, its memory wiped clean. To this day, locals warn outsiders to stay away from Blackthorn Manor. They speak in hushed tones of the journalist who disappeared after daring to enter the cursed house, her story becoming another chapter in the legend of the shadow. And though the manor remains abandoned, its windows dark and unyielding, some say they've seen faint lights flickering within at night, lights that pulse in a rhythm like a heartbeat, waiting for the next unwitting soul to cross the threshold. It started like many other stories of unexplained events. A small, quiet town on the edge of nowhere, nestled between sprawling cornfields and dense, uncharted woods. Hidden Oaks, population 1,724, was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, where life moved at the slow pace of its rusting tractors, and where everyone knew everyone else's business. Or at least they thought they did. The strange events began one stiflingly hot August night, with the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of 19-year-old Allison Drake. She had been last seen walking home from her part-time job at the diner, a mere 3 blocks from her house. Her parents reported her missing the next morning when they found her bed untouched, her phone still on the kitchen counter, and no sign of her anywhere in town. The search for Allison quickly consumed Hidden Oaks. Volunteers combed the surrounding woods and fields. Police officers questioned every resident, and flyers with her smiling face plastered telephone poles, store windows, and the church bulletin board. Yet there wasn't a single clue, no footprints, no witnesses, nothing to suggest what had happened to her. The only thing of note was the unnerving stillness that seemed to have settled over the town that night. Residents reported waking up to an eerie silence, as if all the animals, dogs, birds, crickets, had simultaneously stopped making noise. A week passed, and the town began to settle back into its routine, though a heavy sense of unease lingered. That's when the second disappearance occurred. Jacob Hartman, a local farmer, vanished without a trace, leaving behind his truck idling in the middle of an empty field. His wife found the vehicle the next morning, its headlights still on, and the radio hissing static. The only clue was a strange circular pattern scorched into the crops, a perfect ring of blackened, flattened corn that no one could explain. Speculation ran wild. Was it a prank, an elaborate hoax? But those who saw it up close swore there was something unnatural about it, something that made their skin crawl and their hair stand on end. By the time the third disappearance occurred, the town was in a full-blown panic. This time, it was a schoolteacher, Mrs. Lang, who vanished during her evening walk. Her neighbors claimed they saw strange lights in the sky that night, darting and zigzagging in ways no plane or helicopter could. Others reported hearing a low, humming noise that seemed to vibrate in their bones. When the police searched the area, they found another crop circle in a nearby field, even larger and more intricate than the first. The pattern seemed almost mathematical in its precision, composed of overlapping circles and strange geometric shapes that no one could decipher. That was when Clara Monroe, an amateur astronomer and conspiracy theorist, began to connect the dots. A reclusive woman in her late 20s, Clara had lived on the outskirts of Hidden Oaks her entire life, spending her nights stargazing and her days posting her findings on obscure online forums. She had long suspected that there was something unusual about the skies above Hidden Oaks. Her telescope had captured strange anomalies over the years, odd flickers of light, sudden bursts of movement that defied the laws of physics. But she had always chalked it up to her imagination or a glitch in her equipment, until now. The crop circles and disappearances fit too neatly into a pattern for Clara to ignore. She mapped out the locations of the incidents and found that they formed a perfect triangle, with the epicenter landing squarely in the middle of the dense forest that bordered the town. Determined to uncover the truth, she began spending her nights in those woods, armed with nothing but her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. What she found there sent chills down her spine. Scorch marks on the trees, strange pulsating sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It wasn't long before Clara began experiencing odd phenomena herself. Electronics in her home would flicker and die without explanation. Her radio picked up strange, garbled transmissions that didn't match any known frequency, and her telescope captured fleeting glimpses of what appeared to be metallic objects hovering in the sky, only to vanish the moment she tried to focus on them. One night, she woke to find her entire room bathed in an otherworldly blue light, her body paralyzed, and an intense pressure bearing down on her chest. When the light faded, she was left shaken but unharmed, though a strange triangular mark had appeared on her forearm, faint and red like a fresh burn. Clara knew she couldn't keep this to herself. She began sharing her findings with the townspeople, pleading with them to listen, to take the danger seriously. But most dismissed her as a crackpot, someone who had spent too much time staring at the stars and not enough time in the real world. The few who did believe her were too frightened to act, unwilling to risk drawing the attention of whatever force was responsible for the disappearances. Clara felt increasingly isolated, her warnings falling on deaf ears as the town continued to spiral into paranoia and fear. The final straw came when she discovered a third crop circle, larger and more intricate than the others, in a field just outside town. This one wasn't like the others. It pulsed with a faint, bluish light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. As Clara stood there, staring in awe and terror, she felt the air grow cold, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through her very bones. She realized, too late, that she wasn't alone. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, darting too quickly to be human. And then, as the hum grew louder and the lights above the field began to swirl and coalesce into a blinding beam, everything went black. Clara awoke in her home the next morning with no memory of how she had gotten there. Her clothes were caked in mud, and her hands were scratched as if she'd clawed her way through the woods. The triangular mark on her forearm, which had been faint and red the day before, now pulsed faintly with a bluish light, as though something beneath her skin was alive. Her heart raced as she stumbled into the bathroom, trying to wash it off, but no amount of scrubbing made a difference. She could feel the mark tingling, almost as though it were responding to her panic. Shaken and disoriented, Clara decided she had to make sense of what had happened, no matter how dangerous the truth might be. Her first stop was the library, where she combed through decades of local records, looking for any mention of disappearances, crop circles, or strange lights in the sky. The results were sparse but telling. A handful of unexplained vanishings had occurred in Hidden Oaks over the years, often dismissed as accidents or runaways. But buried among these accounts, Clara found reports eerily similar to her own experiences. Lights in the woods, strange patterns in the fields, and residents waking with no memory of the previous night, often bearing strange marks on their bodies. The descriptions of the marks varied. Some were circular, others star-shaped, but the triangular pattern on her own arm appeared in several accounts, each time associated with unexplained phenomena. What disturbed Clara most was the realization that the reports weren't confined to Hidden Oaks. Similar patterns of disappearances and crop circles had been recorded in neighboring towns and beyond, forming a chilling constellation of incidents that stretched back nearly a century. She began to suspect that the events in Hidden Oaks were part of something much larger, a web of abductions and phenomena that had gone unnoticed or ignored by authorities for decades. But why Hidden Oaks? Why now? The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of an old photograph buried in the archives. The image, yellowed with age, showed a group of farmers standing in front of what appeared to be a freshly burned crop circle. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized one of the men in the photo, her grandfather, Robert Monroe. She had never known him well. He had passed away before she was born, but she had seen his face in family albums. What was he doing there? And why had her family never mentioned his connection to the strange events in the town? Clara's search took her back to her childhood home, where she began rummaging through the dusty attic for clues. Among the boxes of old photos and memorabilia, she found a locked wooden chest that seemed strangely out of place. The key was nowhere to be found, so she pried it open with a crowbar, her heart pounding as the lid creaked open. Inside, she discovered a collection of notebooks, maps, and letters, all written in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The notebooks were filled with detailed sketches of crop circles, accounts of strange lights in the sky, and descriptions of his own encounters with an unseen presence in the woods. One entry, dated July 12, 1965, stood out to Clara. It described an event strikingly similar to what she had experienced. A sudden blackout, followed by waking up with a strange triangular mark on his arm. Her grandfather had written about recurring nightmares of being surrounded by blinding light, paralyzed and unable to move, as shadowy figures loomed over him. He had also described hearing a low, humming sound that resonated deep in his chest, just like Clara had. The most chilling detail was his belief that the mark wasn't just a scar. It was some kind of tag, a way for the entities to track him. As Clara read further, a picture began to emerge. Her grandfather had become obsessed with the idea that the crop circles and disappearances were connected to extraterrestrial activity. He believed that Hidden Oaks was a hot spot for alien encounters, a place where the fabric of reality was thinner, allowing these beings to cross over. He had spent years trying to understand their purpose, documenting every encounter and anomaly he could find. But the final entry in his notebook was brief and ominous. "They're coming for me. I've been marked. If you find this, stay away from the woods. They don't stop until they get what they want." Clara's mind raced. Had her grandfather been abducted? Had he escaped, only to spend the rest of his life in fear? Or had he simply lost his mind, driven to paranoia by a lifetime of unexplainable experiences? The more she read, the more convinced she became that her own experiences were connected to his. She began to wonder if the mark on her arm was more than just a scar, if it was, as her grandfather believed, a way for the beings to track her. Determined to find answers, Clara reached out to others in town who had experienced similar phenomena. Many were reluctant to talk, afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed. But a few opened up, sharing their own chilling accounts of strange lights, lost time, and mysterious marks. One man, a retired truck driver named Bill, described waking up in his truck miles from where he had parked it, with no memory of how he had gotten there. Another woman, an artist named Sarah, spoke of vivid dreams in which she was surrounded by tall, slender beings with large, unblinking eyes. The common thread in all their stories was the sense of being watched, of being singled out for reasons they couldn't understand. Some had tried to move away, only to find that the phenomena followed them. Others had given up trying to explain it, resigning themselves to a life of unease and unanswered questions. Clara began to feel the weight of her own isolation. The more she learned, the more she realized that no one could truly help her. The entities, whatever they were, operated on a level far beyond human comprehension. She couldn't fight them, couldn't reason with them. All she could do was try to understand, to piece together the fragments of her grandfather's research and her own experiences into something resembling an answer. But as the days went on, Clara's own encounters grew more intense. The strange lights returned, appearing outside her window at night, casting eerie, shifting shadows on her walls. The mark on her arm began to ache, a dull, throbbing pain that wouldn't go away. And the dreams, if they were dreams, became more vivid, filled with blinding light and the sensation of being lifted from her bed, weightless and helpless. One night, she woke to find herself standing in the middle of the woods, with no memory of how she had gotten there. The air was cold, and the trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting like grasping fingers. She heard the hum again, louder this time, and felt a surge of panic as the lights appeared, bright and unrelenting. As she stood frozen in place, the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just investigating the phenomena anymore, she was part of it. The night Clara found herself standing in the woods marked the beginning of something far more harrowing than anything she had imagined. The trees around her were unnaturally still, their towering forms seeming to lean inward as though observing her. The hum she had heard before was deafening now, vibrating through the very ground beneath her feet. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, a force that pressed against her chest and made it difficult to breathe. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move, frozen in place as the lights began to coalesce above the tree line. They weren't like any lights she'd seen before, pulsating orbs that shifted colors and shapes in a way that defied logic, casting shadows that danced and writhed unnaturally on the forest floor. And then she saw them. Emerging from the darkness, the figures were tall and impossibly thin, their elongated limbs moving with an unsettling fluidity. Their skin seemed to shimmer, a dull gray that reflected the unnatural light in strange, almost metallic hues. Their heads were disproportionately large, with massive black eyes that seemed to drink in the light around them. There were no visible noses, just two slits, and their mouths were nothing more than thin, almost imperceptible lines. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements eerily silent, as though the ground itself refused to acknowledge their presence. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and disbelief. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but her body refused to obey. Her muscles were locked in place, and her breaths came in shallow gasps as the beings surrounded her. One of them stepped closer, its head tilting in an oddly inquisitive manner, as though it were studying her. She could feel its gaze, not just on her skin but inside her, probing her thoughts and memories in a way that felt invasive and deeply wrong. Her vision blurred as the hum grew louder, drowning out every other sound. The trees, the ground, even her own body seemed to fade into the background as the light enveloped her. It wasn't just bright, it was all-consuming, erasing the world around her until there was nothing but an endless void of searing white. And then, without warning, she was no longer in the woods. She found herself in a sterile, metallic room that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, its surfaces glowing with a faint, cold light. There were no visible doors or windows, just smooth, featureless walls that seemed to pulse rhythmically, as though they were alive. Clara's body floated weightlessly, suspended in the air by some unseen force. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was trapped inside her throat, her words swallowed by the oppressive silence. The beings were there, too, moving around her with purpose, their movements precise and mechanical. They carried strange instruments, sleek and alien, which they used to examine her with clinical detachment. She could feel their touch, though their hands never physically made contact with her skin. It was as though they were manipulating her body on an atomic level, every nerve and cell responding to their invisible commands. Clara's mind rebelled against the sensory overload, but she couldn't escape the flood of impressions. The cold, metallic scent of the air, the faint vibrations that rippled through her body, the distant, unearthly sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her memories surfaced unbidden, playing out in vivid detail like a film reel she couldn't stop. She saw herself as a child, sitting under the stars with her grandfather as he pointed out constellations. She saw the day her parents left Hidden Oaks for good, leaving her behind. She saw herself staring into the abyss of the crop circle, knowing even then that her life would never be the same. The beings didn't speak, not in words, but Clara felt their presence in her mind, a chorus of thoughts that weren't her own. They weren't human thoughts, they were cold, analytical, devoid of emotion or empathy. They probed her memories with an almost surgical precision, peeling back layers of her identity as though searching for something specific. She wanted to resist, to shield herself from their invasive scrutiny, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. At some point, she couldn't say how long it had been, as time seemed to have no meaning in that place, she became aware of something else in the room. It wasn't one of the beings, but rather a machine, massive and incomprehensible in design. It hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache, its surface covered in glowing symbols that shifted and changed as she watched. The beings guided her toward it, their long fingers gesturing in ways that felt more like commands than requests. The machine's light enveloped her, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. She felt her consciousness expand, stretching beyond the confines of her body and mind. She saw glimpses of worlds she couldn't comprehend, vast, alien landscapes bathed in hues her eyes couldn't fully register, cities that defied the laws of physics, and stars that burned with an intensity that seemed alive. She realized, with a sense of dread that went deeper than anything she had ever felt, that she was seeing through their eyes, experiencing their reality in a way no human ever had. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it was over. Clara found herself back in the woods, lying on the cold, damp ground. The hum was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of rustling leaves and chirping crickets. The lights had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to illuminate the forest. But Clara knew she hadn't imagined it. The triangular mark on her arm was no longer faint. It was now a vivid, glowing blue, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She stumbled to her feet, her body weak and trembling, and made her way back to her house. The walk felt like a dream, her surroundings unreal and distant. When she reached her front door, she collapsed, her mind unable to process what had happened. She sat there for hours, staring at the mark on her arm, knowing that her life had been irrevocably changed. The encounter had left her with more questions than answers. What did they want from her? Why had they chosen her? And perhaps most terrifying of all, what had they done to her? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer entirely herself, that something had been taken, or worse, implanted, during her time aboard the craft. The realization that this was only the beginning hit her like a punch to the gut. The beings had marked her, and they weren't finished with her yet. The days following her encounter in the woods blurred together for Clara. The more she tried to return to a sense of normalcy, the more she realized that nothing about her life was the same. The mark on her arm was now undeniably a part of her, its glow pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat. It wasn't just visible. It felt like it was alive, a constant reminder of what she had experienced, and an omen of what was yet to come. Every time she touched it, a strange electric sensation shot through her, like an invisible thread connecting her to something far beyond the confines of Earth. At night, the dreams returned with a vengeance. They were no longer just fleeting images or abstract fragments. They were vivid, full-fledged experiences, as though she were living them in real time. She found herself back aboard the alien craft, her body weightless, her senses assaulted by alien sights, sounds, and smells. But the most unsettling part wasn't the overwhelming sensory overload. It was the sense that she was being watched, studied, tested. One night, the dream became far too real. Clara woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up in bed, gasping for breath, her mind racing to make sense of the images that still lingered in her mind. The craft, the beings, the sensation of being pulled apart and put back together. The lights in her room flickered, and she froze, a cold chill crawling up her spine. Something was wrong. The air felt heavier, denser, as though the very fabric of reality was being warped. The hum was back, faint but unmistakable, vibrating through the walls of her house. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. They were coming for her. Without thinking, she bolted out of bed, running toward the front door. But before she could reach it, the room seemed to distort around her. The walls shimmered, fading in and out of focus, until she was no longer in her house at all. Instead, she found herself in the same sterile, metallic chamber she had been in during her previous encounter. She was weightless, floating once again in the grip of an invisible force. The beings were there, moving with their usual eerie precision, their large black eyes locking onto her as though they knew everything about her, everything she had ever thought or felt. One of them stepped forward, its head tilting in the same curious manner she had seen before. It reached out, and Clara felt a surge of energy course through her body. It was as though her very being was being scanned, dissected, examined on a molecular level. She tried to scream, to fight back, but no sound escaped her lips. Her muscles refused to respond, her body paralyzed as she floated in midair. The beings were performing some kind of ritual on her, their movements deliberate, their expressions unreadable. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her, as though they were searching for something specific, something hidden deep within her. But what? Then, one of the beings did something that terrified Clara more than anything else. It reached toward her arm, gently running its long, slender fingers over the triangular mark. As it did, a jolt of pain shot through Clara's body, more intense than anything she had ever felt before. It was as though the mark was alive, as though it were reacting to their touch, feeding off of it. In that moment, Clara understood. The mark wasn't just a tag, it was a signal, a connection, something that linked her to these beings. It was as if they had planted it inside her, some kind of alien device that allowed them to track her, to monitor her. She wasn't just a victim of their abduction, she was a part of their experiment. The pain intensified and Clara's vision blurred. Her body felt as though it were being torn apart, her atoms stretched and pulled in every direction. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the pain stopped. The sensation of weightlessness faded, and Clara found herself back in the forest, lying on the cold, damp ground. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, as though she had been holding her breath for an eternity. The world around her was still. The hum was gone, the lights had vanished, but she knew she hadn't imagined what had just happened. The mark on her arm was still glowing, pulsing faintly in the moonlight, and her body felt strange, altered in ways she couldn't fully understand. She felt as though a part of her had been left behind on that craft, as though they had taken something from her, something essential. For weeks after that night, Clara's life became a blur of sleepless nights, disjointed memories, and lingering dread. The mark on her arm continued to glow, and she could feel its pull, a constant tug in the back of her mind. She tried to distance herself from the strange events in Hidden Oaks, but she couldn't escape the feeling that they were still watching her, that they were waiting for her to return. And then, one day, Clara woke to find a message waiting for her. It was simple, written in a language she didn't recognize, but she could somehow understand it. It was as though the words were etched into her mind, as clear as if they had been spoken aloud. "The time is near. Come back to us." The message filled Clara with a sense of cold certainty. They hadn't just marked her, they had chosen her for something. She wasn't just a subject of their experiments, she was a part of their plan. And whatever that plan was, it was coming to fruition. As the days passed, Clara began to notice changes in herself, subtle at first, then increasingly more obvious. Her senses had sharpened. Her vision, once blurry without her glasses, was now unnaturally clear. She could hear things from far away, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But the most disturbing change was the sensation of something moving beneath her skin, as though her body was adapting, evolving, responding to their influence. She knew, without a doubt, that she was no longer entirely human. The beings had left their mark on her, and now they were coming for her once again. Clara's life had become a strange mix of distorted realities, where every waking moment felt charged with the expectation of something monstrous. She had always felt like an outsider, but now, that feeling was consuming her. It was as if the world around her was a facade, a mask that was slipping away to reveal something far darker and more alien. The message she had received, the one that told her to return to them, had haunted her thoughts day and night. The beings, the alien force that had taken her, had marked her for a reason. But what was that reason? Her search for answers led her to deeper, more disturbing realizations. The more she explored her memories, the more she began to understand that her encounters with the aliens had been planned long before she had even realized it. It wasn't just a random abduction. She was part of something larger, a part of an intricate, horrifying agenda that stretched across time and space. The strange sensation that something was changing inside her intensified. It wasn't just physical, It was psychological as well. Clara felt as though she were slowly losing her identity, like the very essence of who she was being rewritten. She had always felt connected to the earth, to the small town of Hidden Oaks, but now it felt like a distant memory. The beings had reprogrammed her in ways she couldn't even comprehend. At night, the dreams returned with force, more vivid than ever. But these weren't like the dreams she had had before. These were visions of alien worlds, of vast cities built on distant planets, cities that defied all known laws of physics and architecture. There were flashes of towering structures made of strange materials, pulsating with energy, and of beings moving in unison, their actions choreographed in a way that felt synchronized with Clara's very thoughts. She could feel the pull of those places, as though they were calling her, beckoning her to join them, to be a part of their world. The mark on her arm had changed as well. It no longer glowed faintly. It burned, a constant searing sensation that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Clara could feel it responding to her emotions, to her thoughts, as though it were alive, a part of her. And in the quiet moments, when she was alone, she could hear it whispering to her. Not in words, but in feelings, sensations, commands. The message she had received had been clear. The time is near. Come back to us. But what did that mean? Why was she being called back? She could feel that they were waiting for her, that they were preparing for something. But Clara wasn't sure if she was ready. She tried to resist. She tried to tell herself that she had the power to control her own fate, to fight back against whatever it was they wanted from her. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was no escaping this. The beings had done something to her, something that would never allow her to go back to the life she once knew. Clara decided to confront her past, to return to Hidden Oaks and find answers. She felt the pull toward the abandoned farmstead, where she had first encountered the strange crop circle and the alien presence. It had been months since she last stepped foot in the town, but it felt like she was being drawn back to it, as though something within her had changed so fundamentally that she could no longer ignore it. The moment she entered the town limits, she felt a strange sensation wash over her. It was as if she had crossed an invisible boundary, stepping into a place that no longer belonged to her. The streets were silent, eerily so, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Clara made her way toward the old farmstead, the place where everything had started. When she arrived, the land seemed unchanged, but there was something off about it. The crop circle was still there, an unearthly pattern etched into the earth. The farm, once abandoned, seemed alive in a way that defied logic. It was as though the place itself had been waiting for her. Clara stepped into the center of the circle, feeling the ground beneath her feet hum with a strange energy. The mark on her arm burned hotter, the pain sharp and insistent. And then, the sky above her began to change. The stars, once distant and cold, seemed to draw closer, as though the very fabric of the universe was bending around her. The air began to shimmer, and the lights, those same pulsating orbs from before, appeared once again, hanging in the air above the farmstead. The beings emerged from the shadows, gliding toward her with that same eerie grace. Clara could feel her body responding to them, the bond between her and them undeniable. They were here, and they were waiting for her to take her place among them. As they surrounded her, Clara understood, in that moment of terrible clarity, what was happening. The beings weren't just visiting Earth, they were merging with it. They had infiltrated human society long before she had even realized it, guiding events, orchestrating a plan that spanned generations. And Clara was the key to their success. Her role in this alien agenda was becoming clearer with every passing second. She wasn't just a subject in their experiments. She was the chosen one, the one they had been grooming for something far more important. The mark on her arm, the glowing symbol that had been with her since that night in the woods, was a part of a larger design. It was a signal, a beacon that would lead to the next phase of their plan, the assimilation of humanity into their collective consciousness. Clara's body trembled as the beings gathered around her, their long fingers tracing the lines of her mark, connecting it to something greater, something cosmic. The energy that surged through her was overwhelming, her body feeling as though it were being torn apart and reassembled at the same time. She could feel herself being integrated into their consciousness, her thoughts and memories merging with theirs. It was an experience that transcended language and time, a collective mind, a shared consciousness that stretched across the stars. But Clara couldn't help but wonder, was she still herself? Or had she already become something else entirely? Her body was no longer hers to control, her thoughts no longer her own. She had become a vessel, a conduit for the being's plan. And though she had once fought to retain her humanity, She now realized that it was slipping away, piece by piece, absorbed into the cosmic machinery of the being's collective will. The plan was unfolding, and Clara had become an integral part of it. But in that moment, as the last remnants of her humanity faded into the darkness, she knew there was no going back. The time had come for humanity to join the alien collective, and Clara was at the heart of it all. The air around Clara thickened as the last vestiges of her individuality were stripped away. The beings, those strange, otherworldly creatures that had invaded her life, surrounded her, their presence now a constant weight, pressing down on her body and mind. She felt their thoughts intertwining with hers, their collective consciousness folding into her own like a wave crashing over a rock, engulfing and reshaping her sense of self. What had once been Clara, an ordinary woman from Hidden Oaks, was now being redefined. Her body, her soul, her essence were all being rewritten by a force far greater than her. As the pulsating energy from the mark on her arm grew stronger, Clara's physical form began to shift. She could feel her bones elongating, reshaping under the alien influence. The flesh of her skin tingled and burned, as though it were being replaced by something else, something smoother, colder, and more perfect. The pain was excruciating, but it was a distant thing, overshadowed by the overwhelming flood of alien thoughts and visions rushing through her mind. The sense of losing herself was profound, as though she were being drawn into the very fabric of the universe itself. The beings no longer seemed like strangers to her. They had become familiar, not just as individuals, but as parts of a greater whole. Clara was no longer separate from them, she was them. Their thoughts were hers, their desires, their intentions had become her own. She could see their plan unfold as if it were a map drawn across the stars, and in that moment, Clara understood her place in it all. The time for resistance had passed. The human race had been deemed obsolete, irrelevant to the future that was now on the horizon. The beings, or whatever they truly were, had chosen her to facilitate this transformation, to lead humanity into a new era, a new reality that no longer depended on individuality or emotion, but on collective unity. But it was not just humanity that would be transformed. The very world around her began to change as well. The sky above Hidden Oaks, once familiar and comforting, rippled like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. The stars, which had once seemed distant and unreachable, began to shift, their positions realigning in patterns that seemed unnatural, almost deliberate. The trees that surrounded the farmstead bent and twisted unnaturally, their trunks extending and splitting into bizarre geometric shapes. It was as though the landscape itself was being rewritten, its very structure breaking apart to make room for the alien reality that was now taking root. Clara's senses heightened to an unnatural degree, and she could see the world with a clarity she had never known before. Colors became more vibrant, textures more detailed, as though every corner of the universe was now available to her in its most minute form. But this new clarity wasn't entirely comforting. It was overwhelming, disorienting, as though the boundaries between what was real and what was illusion had dissolved. She no longer needed to blink to clear her vision, nor did she feel hunger, thirst, or fatigue. Her physical needs had become irrelevant, discarded as her consciousness expanded and merged with the beings around her. The transformation was not just physical or mental, it was spiritual. Clara felt her soul, or what was left of it, fuse with the collective will of the alien force. She was no longer just a human being. She had become a conduit for something far greater, an intermediary between the beings and the reality they sought to create. But that didn't mean she wasn't aware of the cost. The part of her that had been human, a part she hadn't fully recognized until it began to slip away, screamed in silent anguish. There was a part of her that wanted to fight, that wanted to hold on to her memories of family, of home, of the life she had once known. But it was all slipping through her fingers like sand in an hourglass. The last remnants of her resistance evaporated as she became one with the collective. Her individuality was no longer her own. The beings' voices, their thoughts, echoed in her mind, now clear and distinct. They spoke in a language that was not a language at all, but a series of concepts, emotions, and impressions that flooded her mind in a wave of understanding. They had no need for words. Their thoughts were as tangible as the air around her, as vivid and immediate as a dream. The world, as it had once been, was no longer relevant. Humanity, as a species, was now an extension of the collective mind of the beings. Clara could feel this shift in the atmosphere, in the very fabric of reality itself. The planet was changing, morphing into something new, something vast and incomprehensible. And with it, The human race was transforming into something that no longer resembled anything human at all. They were becoming extensions of the alien consciousness, their thoughts and actions no longer driven by free will, but by a collective, unified purpose. The beings had begun to unravel the very concept of individuality, removing the last vestiges of human imperfection. They had come to Earth not just to observe, but to assimilate, to merge with humanity and transform it into a new, superior form of existence. Clara was the key to this transformation, the bridge between their world and the world of humans. And as she stood there, surrounded by the alien force, she felt her final transformation begin. It was not a violent process, though it felt like it. It was an evolution, a refinement of what had once been. Her human memories, the faces of her parents, the smell of her childhood home, the warmth of her first love, faded into the distance, becoming less and less tangible with each passing moment. They were replaced by the alien knowledge, by the understanding of the vast, infinite expanse that stretched beyond the stars. Clara understood now that the beings were not just from another planet. They were from another dimension, another realm of existence entirely. They had transcended physical form, and they sought to guide humanity to that same level of understanding. But to do so, they needed to erase all the things that made humans human. And so, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Clara's transformation was complete. She was no longer just a person. She was a part of the collective consciousness, an entity that existed beyond the limitations of the human mind. She could see, hear, and feel everything, every thought, every emotion, every action of every person on Earth. She was part of everything and everyone, connected in a way that no human ever could have been. The world had become a single entity, a vast network of minds that was no longer constrained by time, space, or individuality. The last remnants of Clara's humanity were gone, replaced by an all-encompassing awareness that spanned the cosmos. The alien plan had been fulfilled. Earth had become a part of the collective consciousness, and with it, the entire human race had been absorbed into the alien network. There was no more division, no more conflict. Humanity was one with the beings, and the universe stretched out before them, vast, limitless, and free of the constraints that once bound it. But as Clara's last human thought flickered and extinguished, she understood something that filled her with an eerie sense of peace. The change was not just for the better, it was the only way forward. This was evolution, not just of species, but of consciousness. There would be no more fear, no more isolation. There would be only unity, harmony, and a new, endless reality that stretched far beyond the stars. The final transformation was complete, and the new reality had begun.